supply. I have to remark right at the outset, I can't believe that the Senior Minister isn't here to hear this. It's just unbelievable, to be honest. We're facing an unprecedented housing and homelessness crisis and an accommodation crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people have been let down by this government in providing the most basic thing, which is a secure, affordable roof over the head of individuals, of families, of children. 122,000 households on all the various housing lists. Nearly 11,000 families, including 3,000 children, in homeless accommodation. Now thousands of Ukrainian people fleeing war and conflict in desperate situations, all being failed by the state, all being failed by the government in providing the basic thing, which is to have a roof over your head. And our motion points out that the answer to this crisis is staring us in the face. We have, according to the census, 160,000 vacant properties in this country. 48,000 of them have been empty for 6 years, since the last census. In addition, although we don't do a proper count of derelict properties, it is estimated there are at least 20,000 derelict properties. So the answer to the housing crisis, to the homelessness misery, and to the desperate situation of Ukrainian people who need and deserve our assistance is staring us in the face, is for the state and the government to take the necessary action to bring the property, the housing, the derelict properties into use to house all those who need a secure, affordable roof over their head. The measure we are proposing, because we don't want to just give out about the situation, we are proposing a number of measures that could begin to address it. The central solution, obviously, we haven't even included in this because we put it out there so many times, as have others, is for the government to dramatically ramp up its own direct construction of public and affordable housing on the abundant public land that exists out there. To understand the scale of the government's failure in this regard, if you look at my own area, one of the worst affected by the housing crisis, the Housing for All plan, even if the targets are met in the Dún Laoghaire area, will result in more people being on the housing waiting list when that plan is concluded in 2026 than there are currently. That's how inadequate the plan is, even if the targets are met. And as our motion sets out, the government is failing spectacularly even to meet its own targets for the delivery of social and affordable housing. The government is saying that its target for this year is 9,000 social homes. By halfway through this year, they had only delivered 1,500. They are promising 4,100 affordable and cost rental homes, but have only delivered 325 affordable and 234 cost rental by halfway through the year. So hopelessly inadequate targets and hopelessly inadequate ability on the part of this government to actually implement even its own targets. We acknowledge that, although very belatedly and under massive pressure from the opposition and from public outcry, the government finally brings in an eviction ban to do the obvious thing. Is if you want to address an unprecedented homelessness crisis, you prevent further people from being driven into homelessness, which you have allowed to happen at a spectacular level over the last number of years, where in just 1 year the number of people in homeless accommodation go from 8,400 to 10,800 because you allow people to be evicted into homelessness. When you look at the situation in Tahani House, in Dublin 8, you get an idea of the motivations for people being driven into homelessness. A property owner owns 35 properties, estimated €700,000 a year in income, and he's claiming financial hardship as a justification for evicting 35 households. It's absolutely disgusting. And even the eviction ban you brought in still has the loophole that anybody who got a termination date before the introduction of the legislation will still potentially be evicted over the next few months in the midst of winter, something the government better amend in the legislation that's coming before us in the later afternoon. But to go back to immediate solutions, if we have 166,000 empty properties and 48,000 of them have been empty for 6 years, and we have 20,000 derelict properties, the answer, very simply, is for the government to take those properties into their remit, to acquire those properties and to refurbish them, and have the capacity, the construction capacity, in order to refurbish them and make them available for social and affordable housing. But the government refuses to do that. In my own area, again, for 4 years I've been pointing to just one example of that, St Helens Court, where now I think 17 apartments have been empty for 2 to 3 years, and the landlord, a vulture fund, is trying to evict the rest of the tenants and has been doing that for a number of years. And the government still has not taken control of those properties. So we are saying there should be a use it or lose it provision. If a property is vacant for more than 6 months without good reason, the state should acquire that property, if necessary, through compulsory purchase in order to deliver social and affordable housing. Similarly, we have 80,000 planning permissions currently. But in many cases, the developers are sitting on those sites, drip-feeding housing and watching the value of the property go up. In fact, the worse the housing crisis gets, the more money they make from the value of that property. Those planning permissions and those sites should be taken over by the state in order to deliver social and affordable housing and develop a state construction company, so we are not dependent on private developers to do it, but we do it directly ourselves.
Paul Murphy.
Thanks, Chair. None of this is natural. None of it is inevitable. The scale of the housing crisis in this country and how it affects ordinary people, all of it is a consequence of policy. The almost 11,000 people in emergency accommodation, over 3,000 of whom are children whose lives will be forever blighted by the experience. The hundreds of thousands of people who are stuck living with their parents because they can't afford to rent, the 250,000 people on the social housing waiting list or in HAP or RAS funded precarious private tenancies, students who are asking students' unions if they can pitch a tent on campus because they can't afford to find a room, traveller families in horrific accommodation, and now refugees unable to find shelter having fled war. None of that is natural, none of it is inevitable. It is the consequence of years and years of aggressive neoliberal policies in housing by Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour and the Green Party. And it is all based on a policy which says that the right of all of those people to a home comes second to the right of developers and the right of big corporate landlords to maximise their profit. Fundamentally, their right to do what they want with their private property to maximise their profit comes before the right of society to say, no, we want people in one of the wealthiest countries in the world to actually have a home. It's the consequence of commodification, privatisation and financialisation of housing that unfortunately is taking place right around the world. The issue of vacant properties really gets to the heart of it, because this is the most immediate solution to the crises that people are facing in every community, in every town, in every city across the state. There are vacant properties. It's the most immediate solution to use those vacant properties for people who need them. It's also the most ecologically sustainable solution, because the house that is already built, the cost in terms of carbon emissions of bringing that up to standard and so on is very low compared to the significant greenhouse gas emissions that come with building a new home. We know that according to CSO data, based on the recent census, there's over 166,000 vacant homes across the country. We know that almost 50,000 of those homes have been vacant for 6 years or more. 23,000 of those were vacant even going back to the census in 2011, over 10 years ago. We know on top of that, there's 22,000 derelict buildings in the state at the end of 2021. Even allowing for a certain amount of overestimation of long-term vacant properties, it's clear there is massive potential to immediately bring vacant properties into use as social and affordable homes for the tens of thousands of households desperate for somewhere affordable to live. The issue is for us to say, no, you don't have a right to leave that home vacant in the context of a housing crisis, that if you don't use it, then you will lose it, and the state will intervene and will compulsory purchase the home in order to make it available for people to live in. Beyond that is the issue of the planning permissions. There's an estimated 80,000 housing planning permissions granted nationally but not activated. In the Dublin area, the most recent Housing Supply Coordination Task Force report for the last quarter of 2021 notes there are granted permissions for about 75,000 homes. Of those, just under 9,000 were completed, 18,000 commenced, leaving in excess of 48,000 unused permissions. That's almost 2 in every 3 planning permission not activated in the middle of a housing catastrophe. The Dublin Democratic Planning Alliance collected data on strategic housing developments. By February 2022, that toxic process had granted permission for almost 70,000 units, less than 13,000 had commenced. Even allowing for those under judicial review, there's still 40,000 unused permissions worldwide. So what do we know about who is hoarding this land with planning permissions? Cairn Homes, a stock valuation of close to €600 million, owns land banks that could accommodate 17,700 homes. 82% of these sites have planning permission or are in the planning process. The vast majority of this land is in or around Dublin. But Cairn plans to complete just 1,500 homes this year in the middle of a housing crisis. Similarly, Glenvie Properties owns land banks for over 15,000 homes, but completed just over 1,000 in 2021, in the middle of a housing crisis. Their right to sit on land to try and maximise their profit by building later rather than now is taking precedence over the need for action in terms of the housing crisis. The Business Post reported at the weekend that Minister O'Brien is now considering buying up, quote, dormant housing projects or partnering with other developers. I can imagine that will involve some handsome profit for them. Let's acquire these sites at agricultural prices now, cut out the developers, cut out their profiteering and start direct building by the state and local authorities. I don't understand what the government is waiting for. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. We need a state construction company to deliver all of this, providing thousands of high-quality, well-paid jobs and apprenticeships, working with local authorities to prepare and retrofit vacant properties for occupation and to build new homes on the land banks which are currently being hoarded. The market, which this government defends and allows to rule, has failed to deliver housing completely for a very long time now. The state must step in and do what the market will not.
Minister, I said to you when you walked in here this morning, why are you here and not the Minister for Housing, Darragh O'Brien? And you said you pulled the short straw, and indeed you have. But I'll tell you what I have noticed is that the Minister, unusually, has put in an amendment to our motion. Now, we have been listening to private members' motions here for months now, where there's been no opposition from the government. They don't argue against it, they don't vote against motions, they just ignore them and let them run. This one, however, has been amended, and I've done a count on it. We have 21 short paragraphs in our motion describing what Richard and Paul have just outlaid in terms of what we think should be a beginning of a solution to the housing crisis. The Minister responds with 50 long paragraphs, and this place would drive you to drink, to be honest with you, because yesterday, the same thing happened at the Climate Committee when I asked was there any intention of the government to go to COP27 and argue for more funding for people who are suffering from the extremities of climate change. And I got a civil servant going blah, 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 blah for almost 20 minutes. Can we get decent answers to reasonable questions? And this motion poses very, very reasonable questions, and I want to pose a few more of them. One is in relation to Tahani House, which has been mentioned, in Dublin 8 in Kilmainham. One of our members lives there, a councillor of ours lives there. They've been there for over 10 years. They have spent $120,000 on rent in that 10 years. They are now being evicted by a landlord who happens to be, and I'm saying this for a reason because I'm going to follow on with another argument, one of our own, an Irish man called Ronald O'Donnell, who has made millions out of this block of flats, and he is evicting 35 families. And those families are not just Irish, they come from all corners of the planet, but they all work here, are rearing their children here, and they're all very, very scared of what's going to happen to them. Now, I wrote to the council immediately and said, this is in your area, we need housing, people here who are on the housing list, what are you going to do about it? And their answer is basically that there's no HAP or homeless HAP tenancies in Tahani House. There's a very small number of acting housing applications on DCC's list, and it's not straightforward for DCC to intervene. That tenants in situ protocol cannot be used unless there are HAP or RAS tenants there. So whatever we try to do here with these motions, there's always going to be obstacles with protocols and rules and regulations that are out there that are dragged up and brought in front of us by either local authorities or the Department of Housing. And the truth of the matter is that that is a perfectly good site for the council to buy, regardless of who lives in it. We need more public properties to get people into so that we can house them, so that we can give families security. And even if it was a question of buying it up and fixing it up, there is permanent homes for the future for people, so that they're not putting €120,000 down the toilet in rent over 10 years to be told at the end of it that they're going to be evicted. And this is really, really important in the context of the crisis of Ukraine and the amount of refugees that are coming into this country, because it is phenomenal. But it is nothing like what is going into other countries. Ireland, in fact, is down the table on the number per 100,000 of population of refugees that we are taking in. The biggest amount of refugees that move around this world when people are displaced go to some of the poorest countries and are allowed to stay in the poorest countries for years and get very, very little supports. So when people get very frustrated, and I perfectly understand it, I get it. People are sick of listening to Ukraine refugees getting this, that and the other, and what are we going to do about Ukrainian refugees? I get that. But people have to be very, very careful and remind ourselves that long before ever Russia entered Ukraine to embark on a war, long before there was any crisis in Ukraine and a refugee crisis, we had a deep, extreme housing crisis here. And it was put best to me by a young woman who's 19 years on the housing list in DCC at a public meeting recently in Ballyfermot. Somebody got up and was given out about Ukrainian refugees, and she said, yes, I get it. We all think they're getting everything, but I'm 19 years on the housing list, and that's long before there was ever any crisis in Ukraine. So this housing crisis runs deep, but it will be used to divide people and to put us against each other. And when the question is asked, why do we not look after our own first? Then let's ask the question, who are our own? Well, the landlord of Tahani House is one of our own, if that's how you describe it. So are many of the people who evade paying taxes in this country, many of the landlords who own and sit on empty properties for years on end, and all of the politicians practically in this House are our own. All of the politicians on that side of the House who consistently, in decades of rules from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, have brought us into this housing crisis and maintained us there. So I think it's very important that the issues are dealt with, that the Minister stops playing games, that he turns up here and defends himself. His counter-motion here reminds me of Lady Macbeth, who couldn't protest enough about being accused of doing something that she tried to say she was innocent of. And as Shakespeare said, me think the lady doth protest too much. In this case, me think the Minister doth protest too much, because he is absolutely guilty of all of the problems that have been outlaid here this morning, and the solutions have to be found, and they have to be found urgently. So, Minister, straight away I want you to address today the question of how we are going to deal with local authorities who, when it is needed, refuse to buy properties where tenants are being evicted from. And can we deal with specific cases where occupancies are not necessarily ticking all the boxes of local authorities' protocols, but tick the boxes of the need for ordinary people, for families right up and down this country. And it would accrue to us more public property, more public homes and housing that we would have in a housing stock on a permanent basis. So in the case of Helen's Court or Tahani House or anywhere else, we need to instruct the local authorities to buy where they can, and to fix them up and make them habitable and permanent for people to live in proper, affordable public housing.
Deputy Speaker, if we could avoid naming people in the House.
Sorry?
If we could just avoid naming people. There's a long practice. Thank you. Minister.
Ask you, Corla. And just before I move the amendment, just to state that Minister O'Brien will close the second part of this debate. And it's a busy department. The three ministers share duties, and I think that's common. And I'm sure the deputies will accept that. I move amendment number 1 to delete all words after that Dáil notes that, and substitute the following: acknowledging that there remain challenges to overcome 1 year on from its publication, Housing for All, a new housing plan for Ireland is delivering, through increased housing supply, a range of affordable purchase and rental measures, new initiatives to tackle homelessness, and ongoing long-term reforms of the housing and planning systems. Housing supply is increasing despite such unprecedented challenges arising from the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, increasing interest rates and supply chain issues. In the past 12 months to the end of June 2022, almost 25,500 homes were